The wind carried the scent of iron and rot through the high stone corridors of the Thorn Citadel. It was the smell of fear, old and deeply settled, a stain on the very soul of the castle. Every tapestry seemed to weep with it. Every shadow seemed to whisper a warning. They said the prince was a curse made flesh, a walking omen born under a bleeding moon. They said his touch withered life, and his laughter was a death rattle. As an Omega, Lyraean was used to being invisible, but here, her presence felt like a scream in a tomb. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall loomed before her, promising an audience with a grieving king and a fate far worse than obscurity. Tonight she would walk into the heart of that rot, and she was not certain she would ever walk out again. The guard shoved her forward into the throne room, the sound of the great doors booming shut behind her like the lid of a sarcophagus. The air was thick and cold, smelling of dying embers and old sorrows. Alpha King Theron Thorn sat upon a throne, carved from petrified ironwood, a massive figure draped in shadow and sable furs. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and unmoving, but the grief radiating from him was a palpable force, a winter that had frozen the entire court. His scent filled the room, cracked earth, winter pine, and the sharp metallic tang of spilled blood. Beside him stood his council of elders, their faces grim masks of disapproval, their eyes boring into Lyraean, as if she were a disease carrier. She kept her own eyes downcast, fixed on the cracks in the flagstone floor. Humility was an Omega's shield. Her simple, homespun healer's robes felt flimsy and inadequate under their collective gaze. Her satchel of herbs and poultices, usually a comfort, felt like a fool's burden. What could crushed willow bark and silver leaf do against a curse woven by the fates themselves? "You are the one," the king's voice rumbled. Not a question, but a statement. It was a sound like stones grinding together in the deep dark. Lyraean Corthel, the healer from the Outlands. She swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. "Yes, your majesty." Her voice was small, a thread of sound easily snapped. "Look at me, healer." Slowly, Lyraean raised her head. The king's face was a ruin, handsome once perhaps, but now ravaged by a pain so profound it had carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held no hope, only a desperate, terrible resolve. He looked at her not as a person, but as a tool, the last, most desperate tool to be tried, before a final, unthinkable act. "They say you have a gentle hand," he continued, his gaze pinning her in place. "They say you have soothed fevers the pack healers gave up for lost. They say you sang a dying wolf back from the Shadowlands for one last moonrise. I do what I can, my king. The forest provides, the goddess guides." It was the standard, humble response, the one expected of her station. An elder, a sour-faced man with a cruel twist to his lips, scoffed. "The goddess has clearly abandoned this house, girl. Your folk remedies are an insult to the power of this curse." "Enough, Valerius," the king growled, and the elder fell silent, though his contemptuous gaze never left Lyraean. King Theron leaned forward, the throne groaning under his weight. The firelight caught the silver threads in his dark hair and the deep scars that marred one side of his face, a brutal reminder of a forgotten battle. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Omega. You know why you are here. My son, my heir, Caelric." He spoke the name as if it were a shard of glass in his throat. "He is 8 years of age. He has not been held since he was a babe. He has not felt a kind touch, heard a gentle word, or seen a loving smile. Every nursemaid, every tutor, every guard who showed him even a flicker of warmth, is dead." The final word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Lyraean felt a tremor run through her, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. She had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. Sudden illnesses, tragic accidents, inexplicable heart failures, all following a moment of kindness shown to the young prince, all happening precisely on the night of the next full moon. "The curse feeds on affection," the king elaborated, his voice raw. "It takes root in the heart of anyone who cares for him and strangles the life from them. We have kept him in isolation. His food is left at his door. He is spoken to through iron grates. We have tried to starve the curse, but in doing so..." His voice broke, a crack in the granite facade. We are starving the child. Liran's healer's heart ached. A boy of 8, utterly alone. A touch-starved child in a world where physical contact was as vital as breath. It was a cruelty beyond comprehension. Her wolf, a gentle silver creature that rarely stirred within her, whimpered in sympathy. The instinct to soothe, to comfort, was so deeply ingrained in her that it felt like a physical pull toward the source of that pain, even if she couldn't see it. "Why me?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "I am only an omega. Surely a beta with more experience, or an alpha healer with greater power." "We have tried them all!" the king roared, surging to his feet. The force of his presence slammed into her, an alpha's command that demanded submission. The powerful ones see him as a vessel for a dark power to be contained. The experienced ones see him as a lost cause. They are afraid. They treat him like a monster, and the curse, it seems to slumber in the face of their fear and revulsion. But the boy withers. He does not speak. He barely eats. He is fading into a ghost. He paced before the throne, a caged lion consumed by his own despair. "But you are different. You are an omega. Nurturing is in your blood, and you are expendable." The brutal honesty of it struck her harder than a physical blow. Expendable, she was a lamb being led to a slaughter she had willingly walked toward. She had been chosen not for her skill, but for her perceived weakness, for the lowliness of her rank. If she died, she would not be greatly missed. Her loss would not destabilize the pack or create a power vacuum. She was a calculated risk, a worthy sacrifice. A bitter taste rose in her throat. She had come here not just out of duty, but out of a desperate, foolish hope that she could make a difference, that her life could have meaning beyond mixing herbs and tending to the pack's minor ailments. She had no mate, no pups of her own. Her own family had cast her out long ago, shamed by her barren status. There was nothing for her in the outlands but a quiet, lonely existence. Perhaps this was a better death than fading away, forgotten. "I understand," she said, her voice steadier now. She met the king's tortured gaze with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. "I will not show him affection. I will be his caretaker. I will see that he is fed and that his chambers are clean. I will be a functionary, nothing more. The curse will not find purchase in me." It was a lie, and she knew it. Her heart was an open, bleeding thing. How could she look upon a suffering child and feel nothing? The king stopped pacing and stared at her, a flicker of something. Was it respect, pity, in his eyes? "If you succeed in keeping him alive, in bringing him back from the brink without forming a bond, you will be rewarded beyond your wildest imaginings. You will have a place of honor in this court for the rest of your days." He paused, his expression hardening again. "But if I see a single sign that the curse is taking hold of you, if the markings on his skin begin to glow in your presence, I will have you removed. Do you understand? I will not lose my son. He is all I have left." The threat was clear. Removed was a king's word for executed. "I understand, Your Majesty," she affirmed, bowing her head once more. He sank back onto his throne, the energy draining from him, leaving behind the husk of a broken father. He waved a dismissive hand. "Rorik, take her to the West Tower. She begins tonight." One of the guards, a hulking man named Rorik with a face like a knotted piece of wood, stepped forward. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "This way, healer." His voice was laced with a mixture of pity and disgust. He led her from the throne room back into the cold, silent halls. They ascended a winding staircase, the air growing colder and damper with every step. The tapestries here were faded and torn, the sconces unlit. This wing of the castle was clearly abandoned, save for its one lonely prisoner. The only sound was the scuff of their boots on the stone and the distant mournful howl of the wind. Finally, they stopped before a heavy, iron-banded door. A small barred slot was set at eye level, a tray with a covered bowl and a cup of water on the floor beside it. This was where they left his food, like an animal in a cage. Rorik unlocked a series of heavy bolts, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. He paused with his hand on the latch, turning to face her. His eyes were dark with warning. "Let me give you some advice, Omega," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't learn his name. Don't look in his eyes. Don't touch him. Think of it as a thing, not a boy. It's the only way you might survive the next moon. Liren's heart hammered against her ribs. Thank you for the counsel, she managed to say, though her throat was tight with fear. He gave a grim, fatalistic shrug and pulled the heavy door open, revealing a wall of near impenetrable darkness within. The king may have hope. I don't. No one does. Good luck, healer. You're going to need it. He pushed her gently over the threshold and began to close the door behind her. Just before it sealed her in, cutting off the last sliver of light from the hallway, she heard it. It wasn't a growl or a hiss or any of the monstrous sounds the rumors had prepared her for. It was the smallest, most desolate sound she had ever heard in her life. A soft, broken whimper coming from the deepest shadows of the room. The heavy oak door boomed shut, plunging Liren into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The last sliver of torchlight vanished, and the silence that followed was broken only by the frantic drumming of her own heart and that one desolate whimper that seemed to hang in the chilled air. For a long moment she didn't move, every instinct screaming at her to flee, to hammer on the door, and beg to be let out of this tomb. The scent of the room filled her lungs. Stale air, dust, the faint, sour smell of neglect, and something else beneath it all, something sharp and electric, like the air after a lightning strike. Drawing on a well of calm she didn't know she possessed, Liren forced her muscles to unlock. She was a healer. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. Her hands, trembling slightly, fumbled at the leather ties of the satchel at her waist. Inside, her fingers brushed against dried herbs and tightly bound bandages until they found what she was looking for: a small tinderbox and a stub of a tallow candle. Her back pressed against the cold, unyielding wood of the door, she struck the flint. The first spark died instantly. The second flared for a moment, illuminating a tiny circle of rough-hewn floor stones. On the third try, the spark caught the tinder. With painstaking care, she lit the candle's wick. A small, wavering golden light pushed back the suffocating dark. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The room was larger than she'd expected, and starkly empty. A straw-filled pallet was shoved into one corner, its coverings a rumpled, pathetic heap. There was a small, three-legged stool and a wooden bucket in the other corner. High above, a single, grime-covered window slit offered no light, sealed by the impenetrable night outside. The stone walls were bare, sweating with a damp chill that seeped into her bones. This wasn't a prince's chamber, it was a cell. And in the corner farthest from the door, curled into a shape of profound misery, was the boy. He was a slip of a thing, all sharp angles and pale limbs under a simple, dirt-stained tunic. His hair, a tangled mane of dark thorn black, fell over his face, hiding it from view. He had wrapped his arms around his knees, making himself as small as possible, a child trying to disappear into the very shadows that imprisoned him. The whimper she'd heard had ceased. He was utterly still, as if he'd learned that silence was his only shield. Lirian's heart constricted with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. This was no monster. This was a child dying of loneliness. Rorik's words echoed in her mind. Think of it as a thing, not a boy. But it was impossible. Her every instinct, the very essence of her omega nature, cried out at the sight of such suffering. She took a slow, deliberate step into the room, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. The boy didn't move, but she felt a change in the air, a tensing. He knew she was there. He was watching her through the curtain of his hair. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She did not use his name. A name was a connection, a bond. The king's warning was a brand on her mind. There was no response. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Liren noticed the tray of food left by the door, untouched. A bowl of cold congealed stew and a cup of water. She walked over to it, her candle casting her shadow long and distorted against the wall. She picked it up, the ceramic cold against her fingertips. "You must be hungry," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She placed the candle on the small stool, its light creating a tiny island of warmth in the oppressive cold. She sat on the floor, a respectful distance from him, and placed the tray between them. She did not try to coax him, did not push. She simply waited. Minutes bled into what felt like an hour. The only sounds were the faint hiss of the candle flame and the mournful cry of the wind outside. Liren remained still, her posture non-threatening, her gaze soft and indirect. She focused on her breathing, slowing it, pushing out the scent of fear and replacing it with the calm, steady scent of an omega at peace. Chamomile and clean earth, a scent meant to soothe and reassure. Slowly, tentatively, the boy moved. His head lifted just an inch, and through the tangled strands of his hair, she saw an eye. It was a thorn eye, the color of a stormy sea, but wide and filled with a haunted, animalistic caution. He was assessing her, the way a wild creature assesses a potential threat. He wasn't looking at her as a person, but as a new and unpredictable element in his barren world. Her heart ached for him. She thought of the king's words. No kind touch, no gentle word, no loving smile. He had been starved of the most basic elements of life. How could she possibly obey the king's command to remain detached? It was like asking a river not to flow downhill. Without thinking, she began to hum. It was an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her, a simple wordless tune about the moon watching over lost things until they were found. The melody was soft, a gentle thread of sound weaving through the silence. The boy's head lifted a little more. He watched her, his gaze unwavering. She didn't smile, remembering the dire warning. A smile was affection. A smile was death. She kept her expression neutral, her humming soft and continuous. He uncurled slightly, a small shift of his weight on the cold stone. His scent, which had been sharp with fear, softened. Underneath the grime and neglect, she could smell him now, the clean scent of a child, but woven through with that strange electric smell of ozone and something else, something ancient and wild, like petrichor and crushed herbs after a storm. He pushed the hair from his face with a small, dirty hand. His face was thin and pale, dominated by those enormous, sorrowful eyes. He was the very image of his father, but without the armor of grief and power the king wore. Here was only raw, unprotected vulnerability. And then she saw them, faint silvery lines traced across his cheekbones and forehead, disappearing into his hairline. They were barely visible in the candlelight, like old scars or faint birthmarks. The markings of the curse. The lullaby died in her throat. The reality of her situation crashed down on her again. This small, fragile boy was a vessel for a power that had murdered dozens. Every beat of her compassionate heart was a step closer to her own grave. She should get up. She should retreat to the far side of the room, be the cold functionary the king demanded. But his eyes held her captive. In them, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own status as an outcast. She the barren omega, he the cursed prince. Both of them were thorns on the family vine, loved by none. He pushed the untouched bowl of stew a few inches toward her with his foot. It was a question, a test. Lyraean understood. She picked up the wooden spoon and dipped it into the cold, greasy mess. She didn't eat it. Instead, she just held it, letting him see she meant no harm. Then she set the spoon down beside the bowl, an offering freely given with no demands. For the first time, the boy's expression shifted. A flicker of something other than fear crossed his features. Confusion, curiosity. He looked from the bowl to her and back again. His gaze settled on her face, searching, and against all her resolve, against every warning and every instinct for self-preservation, the corner of her mouth lifted in a small, sad, infinitesimally gentle smile. It was barely there, a ghost of an expression, but to the boy who had never seen one directed at him, it was like the sun rising for the first time. His own lips parted. A tiny, hesitant, unfamiliar movement. A fragile, trembling smile bloomed on his face. It was a breathtakingly beautiful and terrifying thing. The moment it appeared, the world shifted. The air in the room crackled, and a sudden intense cold swept through the chamber, extinguishing the candle and plunging them back into absolute darkness. A gasp was torn from Lyraean's throat, but it was drowned out by a low, humming sound that seemed to emanate from the boy himself. And then light bloomed. It wasn't candlelight. It was a cold, ethereal, silver-blue glow pouring from the markings on the prince's skin. The faint lines she had seen were now blazing rivers of light, intricate patterns of thorns, moons, and ancient runes she had never seen before. They flowed over his face, down his neck, and under the collar of his tunic, illuminating him from within. The light cast the room in a spectral, otherworldly glow, turning the shadows into sharp, menacing things. The boy's smile was gone, replaced by a look of wide-eyed terror. He stared down at his own hands, which were now glowing with the same terrifying brilliance. He began to tremble, a soft keen of fear escaping his lips. The curse had awakened, and it was feeding on her. Lorraine felt it, a strange invisible tether snapping into place between them. It wasn't painful, it was a pull, a resonance, a deep thrumming in her own blood that echoed the light pulsing from the boy. Her wolf, dormant for so long, stirred within her, not in fear, but in recognition. Forgetting the king, forgetting the danger, forgetting everything but the terrified child in front of her, she scrambled forward on her knees. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's all right." He flinched back as she reached for him, his eyes screaming a warning she refused to heed. Her healer's hands, warm and steady, closed over his small, glowing ones. A jolt, powerful and electric, shot up her arms. It wasn't a shock, but a connection. A torrent of emotion flooded her. His years of aching loneliness, his terror of the power inside him, his desperate, bottomless hunger for a kind touch. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to drown her. The markings on his skin flared, the light so bright it was almost blinding. At that exact moment, the great oak door to the chamber crashed open with the force of a battering ram. Torchlight flooded the room, harsh and yellow against the curse's ethereal blue. King Theron stood on the threshold, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Behind him, armed guards stared, their weapons half-drawn, their faces pale with shock. The king's gaze flew from the brilliantly glowing curse marks on his son to Lorraine's hands, which were still clasped around the boy's. He saw the bond, the connection, the catastrophic failure of his command in one damning image. The flicker of hope he might have held was brutally extinguished, replaced by a towering, desperate rage. His voice, when it came, was not the measured rumble of a king, but the raw, guttural roar of a father who believed he was watching his last hope die. "What have you done?" The king's roar was a physical force, a wave of pure alpha power that slammed into Lyran, designed to break her will and force her to her knees. The guards behind him surged forward, their hands going to the hilts of their swords, their faces a mixture of ingrained duty and stark terror. The silver-blue light pulsing from Ceolric cast their shadows long and monstrous against the stone walls. But something inside Lyran, something deeper than fear and older than obedience, refused to yield. Her arms tightened around the small, trembling boy. The electric thrum of the curse was flowing through her, a strange, cold fire that did not burn. It felt less like an attack and more like a circuit being completed. She was no longer just an Omega healer, she was a shield. "No!" Her voice, sharp and clear, cut through the king's fury. It was a sound of such conviction that the advancing guards actually hesitated. "You're frightening him, can't you see?" She looked up, meeting the king's blazing eyes without flinching. In that moment, she wasn't a subject before her sovereign. She was a mother wolf protecting a cub. Rorik, the same guard who had brought her here, was the first to reach her. He was a good soldier, he followed orders. His hand, rough and calloused, clamped down on her shoulder, intending to rip her away from the prince. The instant he touched her, Ceolric cried out, a thin, terrified sound. The silver-blue light radiating from his skin exploded outward in a silent, concussive wave of energy. It was intensely cold, a blast of pure, magical frost that smelled of ozone and sorrow. Rorik was thrown backward as if struck by a battering ram, landing in a heap 10 feet away, groaning. The other guards scrambled back, their swords now fully drawn but useless, against a power they couldn't comprehend. The torches in the hallway flickered wildly, and the air in the chamber dropped 20 degrees. King Theron froze, his rage momentarily eclipsed by stunned disbelief. He stared, not at the downed guard, but at his son. Ceolric had never shown such power, had never wielded the curse as a weapon. It had always been a passive, insidious thing, a poison that worked in the dark. This was different. The curse hadn't just been triggered. It had acted to protect Lorraine. In the ringing silence that followed, Lorraine felt the energy recede, drawing back into the boy. The light on his skin softened from a blinding glare to a steady, ethereal pulse. He was still trembling, but he wasn't looking at the guards or even his father. His wide, luminous eyes were fixed on her face, filled with a desperate, questioning plea. She felt a dizzying weakness wash over her, a subtle but undeniable drain. It was as if a fine thread of her own life force had been pulled from her to fuel that blast of power. The curse was feeding, just as the king had said, but it was also defending her. They were bound together in a terrifying symbiosis. "Leave us," the king commanded, his voice now dangerously quiet. He never took his eyes off of them, this impossible tableau of the expendable Omega and his incandescent sun. The guards scrambled to obey, dragging the dazed Rorik with them. The great door was pulled shut but not bolted. A profound, heavy silence fell upon the room, now lit only by the strange, beautiful, and deadly light of the curse. For a long moment, the three of them remained frozen. Lyran on the floor, holding the source of the kingdom's dread. Ceolric, clinging to her as his only anchor in a storm of his own making. And the king, standing like a stone monolith, his face a battlefield of fury, fear, and a pain so deep it was terrifying to behold. "Let him go, healer," Theron said. His voice scraped raw. "I will not," Lorraine replied, her voice soft but unbreakable. She could feel the boy's heart hammering against her arm, a frantic, terrified rhythm. "It is drinking you," the king stated, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. His scent filled the space, no longer just grief and iron, but something sharper, a desperate, predatory focus. "I can smell it on you. It has already chosen its next meal. Every moment you hold him, you are tying the noose around your own neck." "Then let it," she whispered, stroking Ceolric's hair, which was surprisingly soft beneath the grime. The gesture was instinctual, a simple act of comfort that defied a king's command and a death sentence. The boy let out a shuddering breath and leaned his head against her shoulder, a gesture of absolute trust that shattered what was left of her resolve. This child was starving, and she was the first person to offer him a crumb of comfort. How could she deny him? The king stopped a few feet away. The blue light from his sun carved new shadows on his ravaged face, making him look ancient and weary. "You do not understand what you are dealing with," he said, his voice losing its edge of command and taking on the hollow tone of a man recounting a nightmare. "This curse was not born with him. It was a bargain, made by his mother." Lyraean looked up, her breath catching. The fate of the queen was a forbidden topic, whispered only in the darkest corners of the citadel. Some said she died in childbirth, others that she had fled. The darkest rumors claimed the king had killed her in a rage. "My Ilara, she was like you," Theron continued, his gaze lost in the past. "All warmth and light, but she could not conceive an heir. For years we tried. The elders pressured me to set her aside, to take a new mate for the sake of the line. I refused. I loved her." He said the word loved as if it were a curse in itself. In her desperation, she sought out the old ways. She went to the Whispering Crags and made a pact with a forgotten power, a spirit of blood and shadow. She offered a life for a life, a future soul in exchange for a child. She believed it was a fair trade. She thought she was offering her own. He finally looked at Lyran, his eyes pools of endless regret. The power granted her wish. Ceolric was conceived. But the spirits of the old ways are cruel merchants. They twisted the bargain. The life they demanded was not the queen's. It was the life of anyone who would love her son. Maya Lara was the first. She held him, she sang to him, she adored him. And by the next full moon, a wasting sickness took her. She faded to nothing in my arms. Her last words a warning. She told me what she had done. She told me the curse fed on love. The story settled over Lyran, a shroud of cold, hard fact that smothered the whispers and rumors. This wasn't just magic. It was a wound, passed from a desperate mother to a blameless son. "We tried everything," the king went on, his voice a low growl of remembered pain. "We brought in sorcerers, priests, alpha healers from every pack. One by one, they tried to break it, and one by one, those who showed him the slightest bit of compassion, who let their hearts soften, they died. A kind old beta nursemaid who snuck him a honey cake, a young guard who carved him a wooden wolf. 17 souls, Lyran. 17 pyres I have lit because of the warmth in their hearts." He gestured a massive scarred hand toward Ceolric, who had fallen silent, listening to the story of his own poisoned existence. "So we starved it. We gave it nothing to feed on. We built a wall of fear and coldness around him, and for 5 years the curse has slumbered. The markings faded. No one else died. But my son is dying instead. His gaze fell upon her, hard as granite. You have awakened it. With one foolish, sentimental smile, you have set the beast upon him again, and upon yourself. Lorraine felt the truth of his words settle into her bones. The drain she felt was real. A subtle lethargy was creeping into her limbs. The curse was subtle, patient. It would not kill her with a blast of power. It would use her own compassion, her own omega nature, to slowly and methodically drink her dry. What would you have me do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Let him go, turn my back, and let him wither in this cell? That is a death sentence of another kind. It is the only way. No, she cried, clutching Kelrick tighter. The boy's light pulsed in response, a soft, steady rhythm that matched her heartbeat. There has to be another way. A curse made is a curse that can be unmade. The king let out a short, harsh laugh devoid of all humor. The elders say the only way is to sever the source, a blade in the heart of the child. Lorraine gasped, her blood running cold. You would not. He is Muggle, Theron roared, the anguish tearing through him. I have protected him from them, from their whispers of mercy killings and necessary sacrifice. But if he becomes a true monster, if his power grows beyond containment, what choice will I have? He looked down at his own hands, as if imagining them holding the blade. I brought you here as a last, desperate gamble. I hoped your Omega calm could soothe him without attachment. I see now I was a fool. You are all heart. You were doomed from the moment you walked through that door. He was right, she was all heart. And her heart was already lost. A new resolve hardened within her. She was not one of the 17. She was bound to this child in a way no one else had been. The curse used her, but it also protected her. Perhaps that was the key. Give me a chance, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she had never known. Not to be his keeper, but to be his healer. Let me try to understand this curse, not just starve it. Let me try to break it. King Theron stared at her, a long, searching look. He saw not a frightened Omega, but a pillar of defiance with his glowing sun at her center. She was not asking for permission. She was telling him her intent. For the first time, he was not looking at a tool to be used, or a life to be sacrificed. He was looking at a force to be reckoned with. The full moon is in 13 days, he said finally, his voice flat and devoid of hope. That is how long the curse takes. From the moment of connection to the final breath. 13 days. He turned, his massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of his decision. You will remain here. You will be given whatever you need. Books from the library, herbs from the gardens, food. You will not be disturbed. This chamber is now your world. Yours and his. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the iron handle. He did not look back when he spoke. His final words an epitaph delivered in advance. You have 13 days to perform a miracle, healer. After that, I will be coming not for the boy, but for your body. The king's final words hung in the air long after the door boomed shut, an echo of finality that settled like a layer of frost over the cold stone. 13 days. It was not a reprieve. It was a timer, the slow, steady drip of an hourglass counting down to her own demise. The ethereal blue light from Kelrick's skin softened, casting the small, grim chamber in the colors of twilight and deep water. The raw, primal terror that had seized her in the face of the king's rage began to recede, replaced by a strange, unnerving calm. She was no longer a pawn in a royal tragedy. She was a player. She looked down at the boy still clinging to her. His trembling had subsided, but his small body was rigid with the aftershocks of fear. The curse marks on his skin pulsed in a gentle, rhythmic cadence, like a second heartbeat. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. She could still feel the faint, persistent drain on her own energy, a soft, insistent whisper at the edge of her senses. It was the price of his proximity, the cost of his trust. It's over now, she murmured, her voice a low, soothing hum. We are safe. He looked up at her, his storm-colored eyes vast and searching. He had not spoken a single word, but his gaze was eloquent. It asked 1,000 questions she could not answer. Why did you stay? What is this light? Are you going to leave me too? Instead of answering with words he might not comprehend, she answered with action, gently. She eased him away from her, though his small hands were reluctant to let go. "We need to get you warm," she said, her tone practical, grounding, and clean. She retrieved the stool and placed her satchel upon it, opening it to reveal its neatly ordered contents. Bundles of dried herbs, rolls of clean linen, small vials of tinctures and oils. The familiar scents of lavender, chamomile, and willow bark filled a corner of the room, a small pocket of normalcy in this den of dark magic. Calric watched her every move with an unnerving, silent intensity, his glowing form the only source of light. From her satchel, she pulled a small, rough-spun towel and a cake of soap made with goat's milk and oatmeal. She glanced at the wooden bucket in the corner, grimacing at the stale, stagnant water within. "That won't do," she said to herself. She walked to the heavy chamber door and knocked, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet. "Guards!" There was a muffled shuffling from the other side, then Rorik's voice, wary and strained. "What is it, healer?" "The prince needs a bath. I require a basin and several buckets of hot water, and clean clothes for him, and a proper meal, not that slop you left by the door." A long silence followed. She could imagine the guards exchanging looks of disbelief. No one made demands on behalf of the cursed prince. To care for his comfort was to invite death. "The king said you were not to be disturbed," Rorik finally answered, his voice muffled by the thick wood. "The king gave me 13 days to perform a miracle," Lyra Ian retorted, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "I cannot do that if the prince is freezing and filthy. Are you going to be the one to tell his majesty you denied his son a bowl of warm soup?" Another pause, longer this time. Then the sound of footsteps receding down the hall. Lyran allowed herself a small triumphant smile. She turned back to Calric, who was watching her with an expression of stunned awe. No one had ever advocated for him before. No one had ever demanded he be treated as anything more than a danger to be contained. In that moment, she had not just been a healer, she had been his champion. While they waited, she set about making the cold cell more habitable. She shook out the thin, lumpy mattress, turning it over to the cleaner side. The blanket was threadbare and smelled of mildew. With a sigh of disgust, she folded it neatly and set it aside, making a mental note to demand fresh bedding as well. Her world had shrunk to the size of this room, and she would make it a sanctuary, not a prison. Soon, there was a scraping sound at the door. It opened a crack, just wide enough for a large copper basin to be slid inside, followed by 2 steaming buckets of water, a pile of soft, clean clothes, and a covered tray that smelled deliciously of roasted chicken and fresh bread. The door was then slammed shut and bolted before she could say a word. They were obeying, but they were terrified. She ignored them. Her focus was on the boy. She poured the hot water into the basin, the steam rising in fragrant clouds. She added a few drops of lavender oil from her satchel, and the calming scent began to overpower the room's musty odor. "All right, little one," she said gently, turning to Calric. "Let's get you cleaned up." He flinched back, his eyes wide with apprehension. This was an intimacy he had never known. He hugged his arms around himself, a frail, defensive posture. The light from his skin seemed to intensify slightly, a manifestation of his anxiety. Lyran's heart ached. She knelt before him, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't reach for him. Instead, she dipped the corner of the towel into the warm water and began to wash her own hands and face, humming her soft, wordless lullaby. She showed him that the water was safe, that the process was gentle. He watched, mesmerized. After a moment, his posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. Taking that as her cue, she soaked the towel again, wringing it out until it was just damp and warm. "May I?" she whispered, holding it out. He stared at her hand, then at the towel, then back to her face. Slowly, with a hesitation that spoke of years of solitude, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. With the utmost care, she began to clean his face. The layers of grime melted away under her gentle touch, revealing the fine, aristocratic features of the thorn line. High cheekbones, a straight nose, a stubborn chin. Beneath the dirt, his skin was pale as milk, making the glowing silver markings stand out in stark, beautiful relief. They were not scars. They felt like part of his skin, smooth and cool to the touch. As she worked, she felt that subtle, persistent pull on her own energy, a soft, steady drain that left a trail of cold in its wake. The curse was feeding on the simple act of care, She ignored it, focusing on the boy. She cleaned his hands, his arms, his neck. He remained perfectly still, his eyes closed, a soft sigh escaping his lips. He was soaking in the sensation of a gentle touch, like a parched plant drinks the rain. For 8 years he had been untouchable, a pariah. And now, this. The simple, profound act of being cared for. When she was done, she helped him into the clean clothes, a soft linen tunic and warm woolen breeches. They were too large for his skinny frame, but they were clean and warm. The light of the curse marks was now muted beneath the fabric, visible only as a soft, pulsing glow around his collar and cuffs. He looked like a different child, not a feral creature in the shadows, but a boy, a prince. Next, she turned to the food. She uncovered the tray, and the rich aroma filled the room. There was a small roasted chicken, a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pitcher of fresh milk. It was a feast compared to the cold stew from before. His eyes, wide and luminous, fixed on the food with a desperate hunger. She broke off a piece of chicken and a chunk of bread and put them on a plate for him. He devoured it, not with the savagery of a starving animal, but with a quiet, intense focus, as if he couldn't believe it was real. Lyraean ate as well, forcing herself to chew and swallow despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She needed to keep her strength up. The curse was a patient predator, and she was its only available prey. After they had eaten, a comfortable quiet settled between them. Keilrik, his belly full and his body warm for the first time in memory, curled up on the newly turned mattress. He didn't sleep, but watched her as she began to go through the books the king had sent. They were ancient leather-bound tomes, their pages brittle with age. The lexicon of ancient curses, blood pacts and soul bargains, the runic language of the first men. It was a library of forbidden knowledge, a collection of texts that spoke of magic as a raw, living thing, full of bargains and betrayals. Hours passed. The only light was the steady, soft blue glow from Keilrik. Lyraean read until her eyes burned, her fingers tracing over faded diagrams of ritual circles and passages written in a spidery, archaic script. Most of it was useless, curses of blighted fields or twisted limbs. Nothing matched the unique, symbiotic nature of Keilrik's affliction. Nothing spoke of a curse that fed on love. She found one passage, however, in a chapter on symbiotic pacts, that made her blood run cold. A curse woven from a life force offering, she read aloud, her voice a hushed whisper, cannot be broken by force or exorcism. It is not an external parasite, but an integral part of the host's soul, grafted to their very spirit. To destroy the curse is to destroy the host. The bond can only be transferred. She looked over at Keilrik, who had finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. His curse marks pulsed softly in time with his breathing. Transferred. What did that mean? The text offered no further explanation, the rest of the page eaten away by mildew and time. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over her. It was more than just fatigue from reading. It was a deep cellular weariness. The curse. It was working on her, slowly, methodically. She felt a chill deep in her bones that had nothing to do with the cold of the room. This was how it started. A slow, creeping cold, a gradual fading of her own inner fire. She lay down on the floor, pulling her cloak around her for warmth, her head resting on her satchel. She was only a few feet from the sleeping prince. She could hear his soft, even breathing. She could feel the gentle thrum of his magic in the air. 13 days. No, 12 now. The night was already bleeding into the gray hint of dawn at the window slit. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The king's words, the ancient text, the boy's silent pain, it all swirled in her mind. She thought of her own life, a quiet, lonely stream meandering toward an empty sea. She had been cast out, deemed worthless because her body could not create life. And now she was here, fighting to save a life that everyone else had given up on. A life that was actively, willingly consuming her own. A strange sense of peace settled over her. Maybe this was her purpose. Not to create a new life, but to save this one. Maybe her barrenness wasn't a curse, but a shield. A heart that had never been filled with a mate's love or a child's adoration might just have enough room, enough strength, to absorb this terrible, lonely magic. Just as she was drifting off, a small, warm hand slipped into hers. Her eyes snapped open. Keilrik was awake, watching her in the pre-dawn gloom. The glow from his skin was very soft now. A barely there shimmer. He said nothing, but his fingers tightened around hers. A small, trusting anchor in the dark. She did not pull away. She held his hand, her thumb gently stroking the back of his. At his touch, the glowing marks on his skin flared for a brilliant, breathtaking second. She felt a sharp, icy pang deep within her chest, a feeling like a vital thread being pulled loose. It was the most potent drain she had yet experienced, a direct payment for a moment of shared, deliberate affection. The light subsided. The pain faded to a dull ache. She was weaker. He was calmer. It was a terrifying, heartbreaking transaction. And in the deep, shared silence of the dying night, as the first hint of gray light touched the high window, the boy spoke for the first time. His voice was a small, unused, raspy thing, a sound of rust and velvet. Stay. The night of the full moon rose like a phantom, its light a sickly silver wash over the black stone of the thorn citadel. Every shadow seemed sharper, every gust of wind a mournful whisper. For Lyraean, the world had taken on a dreamlike quality. A profound, bone-deep weariness had settled over her, and the air felt too thick to breathe. The curse was finishing its work. The 13 days were up. Her life was a candle burned down to a final, flickering stub. She could feel the last of her warmth being siphoned away, a constant, icy pull toward the small, silent boy who now refused to leave her side. Kelric seemed to sense the finality of the night. He had not spoken all day, his large, stormy eyes following her every slow, deliberate movement. The silver-blue markings on his skin were agitated, pulsing with a nervous, erratic rhythm beneath his tunic. He knew a reckoning was coming. When the guards came, their faces grim under the light of their torches, Kelric didn't cry out. He simply pressed himself against Lyran's side, his small hand gripping the fabric of her robe with a strength that belied his size. She rested a hand on his head, the gesture costing her a reservoir of strength she could barely afford. King Theron stood behind the guards, already clad in the ceremonial leathers of the rite. His face was a mask of cold, hard resolve, but his eyes were a maelstrom of agony. He looked at Lyran, and in his gaze she saw a terrible apology and a silent, shared vow. Their desperate, impossible plan was the only thing standing between his son and the pyre. "It is time," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. The procession to the stone circle was a slow, silent funeral march. The pack lined the corridors and castle grounds, their faces a sea of suspicion, fear, and morbid curiosity. They stared at the prince, not as a child, but as an abomination. They stared at Lyran, the foolish Omega, who had dared to love a curse, her pale face and slow gait a testament to her impending death. They saw her as a warning. Lyran walked with her head held high, Kelric a permanent fixture at her side. She leaned on him as much as he leaned on her. Theron walked on Kelric's other side, a formidable, silent guardian. They were a trinity of outcasts, a small, isolated island in a hostile sea. The king, the curse, and the sacrifice. A trinity of thorns. The stone circle was in a clearing deep within the ancient woods, a place pulsating with old raw magic. Massive, moss-covered monoliths reached toward the sky like the bones of forgotten gods, and the full moon hung directly overhead, a perfect cold eye in the ink-black sky. In the center of the circle, a massive bonfire raged, its flames leaping high, casting dancing, demonic shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the acrid smoke of burning wolfsbane. Elder Valerius stood before the fire, his staff of twisted ironwood in his hand, his face alight with a fanatic's zeal. He looked at Kelric with a chilling lack of pity, his eyes seeing only a stain to be cleansed. "The hour is upon us," Valerius's voice boomed, sharp and imperious. "The moon is at its zenith. The sacred fire is ready. Bring forth the vessel of the affliction." 2 guards stepped forward, their intent clear. Kelric let out a terrified cry and clung to Lyran, his light flaring into a blinding defensive corona. "No," Lyran's voice was a weak but defiant thread of sound. "I will bring him." She took a slow, painful step into the circle, Kelric moving with her. The heat of the fire was a physical blow, and the raw magic of the place made her head swim. She could feel the curse on Kelric reacting to it, writhing under his skin like a living thing. "The Omega's life is forfeit," Valerius declared, pointing his staff at her. She is tainted by the curse. She must not interfere. Seize the boy. But before the guards could move, King Theron stepped into the circle, placing himself between them and his son. He was a figure of immense, formidable power, his alpha presence silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "The boy will not be touched," he commanded, his voice the low, dangerous growl of a cornered wolf. Valerius sneered, emboldened by the support of the council. "Have you forgotten your duty, my king? Or has the curse finally clouded your mind? The law is clear. The pack must be purified." "There will be a purification," Theron said, his gaze locking with Lyran's over Ceolric's head. It was time. "But not the one you expect." He knelt, bringing himself down to his son's level. The entire pack held its breath, watching in stunned silence. A king kneeling to the curse. Ceolric trembled, his terrified eyes darting between his father and the raging fire. "Ceolric," Theron said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. "Look at me." Slowly the boy did. "I am your father," Theron continued, his voice breaking. "And I have failed you. I let them treat you like a monster because I was a coward. No more." He drew a ritual knife from his belt, its obsidian blade seeming to drink the firelight. Ceolric flinched, but Lorraine put a steadying hand on his back. Ignoring the gasps from the crowd, Theron sliced his own palm, a deep, clean cut from which his blood, dark and rich with alpha power, welled immediately. He held his hand out to his son. "This curse was born of a mother's love," he declared, his voice ringing with power and conviction. "It will be claimed by a father's." He looked at Lyran, his eyes begging her to be strong for this final, terrible act. She nodded, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She knelt behind Ceolric, her frail body shielding him from the back. She placed her hands on his shoulders, becoming the anchor, the conduit for the storm to come. "A bond of blood and ash," she whispered the words from the ancient text. "A soul for a soul." Theron took Ceolric's small hand and, with a swift, merciful movement, made a small cut on his palm, mirroring his own. Ceolric cried out, a sharp sting of pain, but Theron was already pressing their wounds together, palm to palm, blood to blood. The moment their blood mingled, the world exploded. A gale-force wind erupted from the center of the circle, whipping the fire into a roaring vortex of orange and blue flame. The ground trembled, and a low humming sound vibrated up through the ancient stones. The curse marks on Ceolric's skin blazed with the light of a dying star, so bright that the crowd cried out and shielded their eyes. The curse was being torn from its host. Lyran felt it as a physical agony. The bond she shared with Ceolric became a conduit of pure, raw power. The full force of the curse, 8 years of pain, loneliness, and dark magic, surged through her on its way to its new vessel. It was a river of ice and fire, scouring her from the inside out. A scream was torn from her throat, a sound of pure, undiluted agony as every last drop of her life force was burned away in a single, shattering crescendo. She was the bridge, and the bridge was being consumed by the torrent. Through the blinding light, she saw the curse marks on Ceolric's skin peel away like burning embers, dissolving into nothingness. His small body went limp, the light within him extinguished. Simultaneously, new lines of silver fire began to etch themselves onto the king's skin. They crawled up his arm, over his shoulder, and across the scarred side of his face, weaving an intricate, beautiful, and terrible pattern of thorns. He roared, a sound of unimaginable pain and kingly defiance as he took the full weight of the ancient pact into himself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The wind died. The fire settled back into a normal blaze. A profound, ringing silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the crackling of the flames. Ceolric, his skin now unblemished and pale, slumped forward, unconscious. He was just a boy. King Theron remained kneeling, his head bowed, his body trembling with the aftershocks. The new curse marks on his skin pulsed with a cold silver light, a permanent crown of isolation. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes, now glowing with a faint ethereal light, found Lyran. She was still kneeling behind his son, her hands resting on his small shoulders. The light in her was gone. The color had fled from her face, leaving it as pale as the moon above. A single perfect tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Her eyes, fixed on the boy she had saved, were open, but they saw nothing. Her last breath had been stolen by the storm. With a shuddering gasp, Theron gathered his son into one arm. Ceolric was warm, breathing, and blessedly, wonderfully mundane. He was free. Then, with an agonizing slowness, the newly cursed king reached out his other hand, his glowing fingers trembling, and gently closed Lyran's eyes. His touch, which would now bring death to any who earned his love, was her final benediction. He had saved his son. He had lost his savior. The price had been paid in full. 5 winters had passed since the night of the full moon and the sacrificial fire. 5 years since the curse had found a new home. The Thorn Citadel was no longer a place of whispers and rot. It was a place of deep, reverent silence. The fear had not vanished, but it had changed its shape. It no longer coiled around the young prince, but radiated, like a palpable cold, from the ironwood throne. King Theron Thorn was now known in the far-flung territories as the Ice King. He ruled with an unassailable authority, his gaze so heavy with power and sorrow that none could meet it for long. The silver markings of the curse were a permanent fixture on his skin, a web of beautiful, deadly thorns that crawled from beneath his high collar and across the scarred side of his face. He wore gloves of black leather at all times, and no one, not even his most trusted advisors, stood closer than 10 feet from his person. He was a figure of myth, a king who had swallowed a demon to save his line. His court was one of order and rigid formality, devoid of the warmth and easy camaraderie of other packs. There was no touching, no casual embraces. The king's affliction had reshaped their entire culture into one of respectful distance. Valerius and his faction had been broken that night, shamed into obscurity by a display of paternal love so absolute it had defied magic and death. They were gone, their whispers replaced by a profound, fearful awe. At the foot of the dais, no longer hiding in shadows, stood Prince Ceolric Thorn. At 13, he was tall and strong, his shoulders broadening, his face losing the last of its childish roundness. He had his father's stormy eyes and his mother's fine-boned features. His skin was clear, his laughter was easy, and his presence brought not a chill, but a quiet warmth to the cold stone halls. He was the promise of spring in a kingdom ruled by winter. He stood with a straight back, listening as his father delivered a judgment. The king's voice was the same deep rumble, but it was flatter now, stripped of all passion. Passion was a form of love, and love was a poison he could no longer afford. When the court was dismissed, the great hall emptied, leaving only the father and the son in the vast, echoing space. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the calculated distance. It was an abyss of love that could never be crossed. A hug, a comforting hand on the shoulder, these simple acts were lost to them forever. "Your studies with the weapons master go well?" the king asked, his gloved hands resting on the arms of his throne. "Yes, Father Ceolric replied, his voice clear and strong. "He says I have a good arm, but my footwork is clumsy." "Your mother was the same," Theron said, and a flicker of something, a memory, a ghost of warmth, passed through his eyes before the ice returned. "Practice will cure it." "I will," Ceolric promised. He hesitated, a question in his eyes he already knew the answer to, but he asked it sometimes, just to hear the words. "Will you come to the training yards tomorrow?" Theron's gaze was steady. "I will watch from the western battlement, as always. From a distance, always from a distance." Ceolric nodded, a familiar ache in his chest. "I am going out to the garden now," he said. The king's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "See that the silver leaf is not being choked by the nettles." Her hands were always fighting them. "I know," Ceolric said softly. "I remember." He gave a slight, formal bow and turned, his footsteps echoing as he walked away from the throne, toward the sunlight. Theron watched him go, a fierce, silent pride warring with the eternal, aching cold. He could not touch his son, could not guide him with a steadying hand. He could only love him from afar, a lonely lighthouse guarding a precious ship. Ceolric left the cold citadel behind, walking the familiar path into the woods. But he did not go to the old, terrible stone circle. That place had been declared forbidden, left for the forest to reclaim. His path led to a sun-dappled clearing on a gentle slope overlooking the valley. Here, surrounded by a low stone wall he had built himself, was a garden. It was a chaotic, beautiful tangle of herbs and wildflowers. Chamomile, lavender, willow, and a dozen other healing plants grew in thick, fragrant patches. This was Liren's grave. There was no grand monument, only a single smooth river stone at the center of the garden, with one word carved into it: stay. This was Kelric's true inheritance. Not the throne, not the crown, but this small patch of earth. He had learned the name of every plant, their uses, their scents. He spent hours here, his hands in the dirt, tending the living memory of the Omega, who had taught him what a gentle touch felt like, what a kind word sounded like, what a smile was. Her sacrifice was not a ghost that haunted him, but a quiet strength that lived within him. He was kind to the servants. He learned the names of the Omega workers. He knew that true strength was not about power and command, but about the courage to care. He would be a different kind of king. He knelt, his fingers gently pulling a stubborn nettle from beside a patch of silver leaf. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost smell it. Not just the plants, but the phantom scent of chamomile and clean earth that had been his only comfort in the dark. He had loved her, and that love had not killed him. It had saved him. High above on the western battlement of the citadel, a lone figure stood watching. The wind whipped at the king's dark cloak, but he did not seem to feel the cold. He was the cold. From this distance, he could see his son, a small figure of life and hope, kneeling in the sunlight. He could see the garden blooming, a testament to a love that had been stronger than any curse. Theron raised a gloved hand and touched the silver markings on his own face. They were his crown, his prison, and his redemption. Love had once doomed a kingdom. Now a king's love held it safe, chained in ice. And in the heart of the future king, an Omega's love had planted a garden that would bloom forever.